The millionaire CEO demanded an abortion. 5 years later, he saw her with triplets and froze in the mall. A very powerful story for my beautiful family. I'm sure you will enjoy it. God bless you. Let's start the story together. There are two kinds of wealthy men in this world, those who earn their fortune and those who inherit their cruelty. Adam Voges was born into the second category, raised in marble hallways where compassion was considered weakness and love was merely a transaction. He had never known hunger, never felt rejection, never understood what it meant to lose everything. But on a cold morning in November, he would make a choice that would teach him the true cost of pride. Andrea Moreau sat in the waiting room of the Vosges family estate, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on her growing belly. She wore a simple blue dress, the nicest thing she owned, though it felt painfully inadequate in this palace of wealth. The walls around her were covered in oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, each one seeming to judge her presence. She didn't belong here. She knew it. They knew it. But she had come anyway, because she believed that even the coldest hearts could be moved by the miracle of life. It had been 3 months since the agreement. Adam and his wife Sophia had hired Andrea as their surrogate after Sophia's affair had left their marriage broken and childless. Sophia couldn't carry a pregnancy to term, the doctor said, though Andrea suspected the real issue was that Sophia simply didn't want to. The compensation was generous, enough to pay for Andrea's law degree, enough to change her life. She had signed the papers with hope in her heart, believing she was helping create a family. Then came the ultrasound. 3 heartbeats instead of 1. Triplets. Andrea had wept with joy when she heard the news. 3 tiny souls growing inside her, 3 chances at life, 3 miracles. She had rushed to tell Adam, expecting him to be thrilled. Instead, his face had gone pale. He'd asked her to wait, to say nothing to anyone, while he handled things with the family. Now she understood what handling things meant. The door to the study opened, and Adam emerged first. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Behind him came Celestine Vosges, Adam's mother, a woman whose beauty had long ago hardened into something cruel. Her jewelry probably cost more than Andrea would earn in a lifetime. Philip Voges followed, Adam's father, a man whose silence was more cutting than any words. And finally Sophia, wearing a smile that made Andrea's blood run cold. "Sit down, dear," Celestine said, though it wasn't a request. Andrea remained standing. "Is something wrong?" Celestine's laugh was like ice cracking. "Wrong. My dear girl, everything is wrong. We hired you to provide us with an heir, 1 child, 1 clean, simple transaction. Instead, you come back with 3. I didn't choose this," Andrea said quietly. "It's a blessing. 3 babies. 3 complications," Philip interrupted. His voice was flat, businesslike. 3 inheritance issues. 3 potential claims on the family assets. This is unacceptable." Andrea's hand moved protectively to her belly. "What are you saying?" Sophia spoke for the first time, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "What we're saying, Andrea, is that we need to simplify this situation. Selective reduction is perfectly safe. The doctors assure us—" "No." Andrea's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the room like a knife. "Excuse me." Celestine's eyes narrowed. "I said no." Andrea's voice grew stronger. "These are human lives. I'm not going to end them because you find them inconvenient." "Then you're in breach of contract," Philip said calmly. "We can sue you for everything you have, everything you'll ever have." "Sue me, then." Andrea's hands were shaking, but she held her ground. "I have nothing, but these babies have everything. They have life, and I won't take that away from them." Adam finally spoke, his voice hollow. "Andrea, be reasonable. Think about your future, your education. Everything we promised you." "I am thinking about the future," Andrea said, turning to face him directly. "I'm thinking about 3 children who deserve to exist. I'm thinking about what kind of person I'd have to become to destroy them for money." She paused, searching his face for any sign of the man she thought she knew. "I believed you were different, Adam. I believed you when you said you wanted to be a father." "He wants to be a father to 1 child," Sophia interjected sharply. Not to raise a litter. The word litter hung in the air like poison. Andrea felt something break inside her chest, but she refused to let them see her cry. "Let me be very clear," Celestine said, stepping forward. Her perfume was expensive and suffocating. "If you continue with this pregnancy, you will receive nothing. No compensation, no support, no connection to this family. You will be on your own. We'll make sure no one hires you," Philip added. "We have connections everywhere. Law firms, universities, hospitals. Your name will be worthless." Andrea looked at each of them in turn. Celestine's cold eyes, painted with makeup that couldn't hide the cruelty beneath. Philip's cruel indifference, his manicured hands folded as though he was discussing stock portfolios rather than human lives. Sophia's barely concealed satisfaction, finally having someone beneath her to crush. And finally, Adam. He stood slightly apart from his family, his jaw clenched, his hands in his pockets. For a moment, she thought she saw conflict in his expression. For a moment, she hoped he would speak up, would choose differently, would remember the man he'd pretended to be when he'd convinced her to carry his child. But he said nothing. He stood there, silent and complicit, and in that silence, Andrea heard everything she needed to know. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, growing wider with each passing second. Andrea realized with sudden, crushing clarity that she had been a fool. She had believed in fairy tales, in the idea that wealth and goodness could coexist, that these people were capable of love. She had believed Adam's warm smiles during their meetings, his gentle questions about her well-being, his promises that she would be taken care of. She had been so desperately naive. "Then I suppose we have nothing more to discuss," Andrea said quietly. She turned toward the door, her legs feeling weak, but her spine straight. She had almost reached it when Celestine's voice stopped her one last time. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life, girl. You'll regret this. You'll be begging on street corners with those bastards, and we'll drive right past you. You could have had everything, and instead you'll have nothing. Nothing but poverty and shame and 3 mouths you can't feed." Andrea's hand rested on the doorknob. She didn't turn around, but her voice carried clearly through the vast room, steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "The only regret I'll carry is that I ever believed you people had hearts." She walked out of the study, down the long hallway lined with paintings of dead people who probably shared the same empty souls as their descendants. Her footsteps echoed on the marble floors, each step taking her further from the life she'd imagined and closer to an uncertain future. The butler opened the front door without a word, though she saw something like pity in his weathered eyes and perhaps respect. The November air hit her face, cold and sharp, as she descended the stone steps that seemed to go on forever. At the iron gates, Andrea paused. She turned back one final time, looking up at the massive estate with its perfect lawns and its rotting heart. Through a second-floor window, she could see Adam standing alone, watching her leave. Even from this distance, she could see his hand pressed against the glass. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the slight flutter of movement within. 3 lives, 3 souls who would never know the coldness of this place. 3 children who would be raised with love. Even if she had to work herself to the bone to provide it, the day will come, Andrea said, her voice carrying on the wind. Though she didn't know if anyone could hear, "When you'll beg for what you just threw away." Then she walked through those gates, leaving behind the life she'd dreamed of and stepping into the unknown. She had no money beyond her meager savings, no home except the tiny room she rented week to week, no plan except to survive. But she had something the Voges family would never possess, something they couldn't buy or inherit or steal. She had the courage to choose love over comfort, truth over convenience, life over legacy. Behind her, standing at that second-floor window, Adam Voges watched until she disappeared from view. His hands were pressed against the glass so hard his knuckles had turned white, his breath fogging the window. His mother's voice called from downstairs, sharp and commanding, summoning him back to sign papers, to finalize the severing of all ties, to move forward as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. As he watched Andrea's figure grow smaller in the distance, her blue dress a tiny spot of color against the grey November day, Adam felt the first crack in the armor he'd worn his entire life. It was small, barely noticeable, like a hairline fracture in marble. He didn't know it yet, but that tiny crack would eventually shatter everything. He turned from the window and went downstairs to sign the papers, to do what his family expected, to choose wealth over the 3 lives growing in the woman who had just walked away. He told himself it was the practical choice, the logical choice, the only choice that made sense in the world he inhabited. His mother smiled with approval as he signed. His father nodded, satisfied. Sophia kissed his cheek and whispered about their future, about the life they would build without complications. He told himself many things in the days and weeks that followed. He told himself the babies weren't really his, not legally, not truly. He told himself Andrea would be fine, that women like her always found a way. He told himself he'd done the right thing for everyone involved. He told himself until the lies became almost believable. Almost. But late at night, when Sophia slept beside him and the house was silent except for the ticking of expensive clocks, Adam would lie awake and see Andrea's face, the way she'd looked at him with such faith, such hope, such belief that he was better than his family. The way that faith had died in her eyes when he'd said nothing, done nothing, chosen nothing. He'd close his eyes and try to forget, but the image remained, burned into his mind like a brand. A woman in a blue dress, walking away through iron gates, carrying 3 lives he'd abandoned without ever knowing their names. Something inside him had fractured that day, something fundamental that would take years to fully break. Chapter 2. The Furnace of Survival. The Southside district smelled like rain and resignation. Andrea Moreau climbed the narrow stairs to her new apartment, her thrift store bags heavy in her hands. The building was old, the kind where pipes groaned through the walls and the hallway lights flickered like dying fireflies. Someone had spray-painted words on the stairwell that Andrea chose not to read. The carpet was worn through in places, showing the concrete beneath, but it was hers. The rent was cheap enough that she could afford it on her savings, at least for a few months. After that, she'd have to figure something out. The apartment itself was barely larger than the walk-in closet at the Vosges estate, one room that served as bedroom, living room and kitchen all at once. A bathroom so small she could touch both walls while sitting on the toilet. A single window that looked out onto a brick wall, so close she could have reached out and touched it if the window hadn't been painted shut years ago. The previous tenant had left a mattress stained and worn, but Andrea had bought sheets to cover it. She'd also found a small table, 2 chairs with wobbly legs, and a hot plate at the thrift store. Andrea set down her bags and sat on the bare mattress, her hands instinctively moving to her belly. The babies were active today, all 3 of them moving in their cramped space. She could feel distinct movements now, a foot here, an elbow there, 3 separate little humans growing inside her. "We're home," she whispered. Then, despite her determination to stay strong, she began to cry. The tears came from somewhere deep, a place she'd been holding shut since she walked out of that mansion. She cried for the naivety that had made her believe she could trust them. She cried for the law degree that now seemed impossibly far away, a dream that belonged to a different life. She cried for the loneliness that pressed down on her like a physical weight, the knowledge that she had no one in this world who truly cared, whether she lived or died. She cried because she was terrified and exhausted, and so utterly alone it felt like drowning. But mostly, she cried because despite everything, despite the fear and the poverty and the impossible road ahead, she was relieved. Relieved to be away from those cold people with their colder hearts. Relieved that her babies would never know what it felt like to be valued only as assets, as complications, as problems to be eliminated. They would know poverty, yes. They would know struggle. But they would never know the hollow emptiness of being unwanted. When the tears finally stopped, Andrea stood up and began unpacking her few possessions. She had work to find, mouths to feed, and life to build from nothing but determination and love. The next morning she started walking, up and down the streets of Southside, pushing through every door with a help-wanted sign in the window, filling out applications with hands that cramped from gripping the pen too tightly. Most places took one look at her pregnant belly and found excuses. Position just filled. We'll call you. Not hiring right now, after all. Some managers didn't even pretend, just looked at her stomach and shook their heads. But desperation has a way of sharpening perception. And Andrea learned quickly which managers had kind eyes and which had hungry ones. She learned to stand straighter, to smile wider, to make herself seem capable and unthreatening and worth the risk. She learned to lie about when the baby was due, adding months to give herself more working time. After a week of rejection, she found her first job. Night custodian at Pemberton Tower, a commercial building downtown. The manager was an older woman named Ruth, who looked at Andrea with knowing eyes. "You pregnant?" Ruth asked bluntly. Andrea almost lied, then decided against it. "Yes, how far along?" 6 months. Ruth studied her for a long moment. "The work's hard. Mopping, scrubbing, trash removal. Can you handle it?" "I can handle anything," Andrea said, and meant it. Ruth hired her on the spot. The pay was minimum wage. The hours were brutal. 10 at night until 6 in the morning, but the money was steady, and they didn't ask questions. Andrea started that night. The work was harder than she'd imagined. Her belly had grown large, making it difficult to bend, to reach, to move. Her back ached constantly. Her feet swelled so badly that by the end of her shift she could barely squeeze them back into her shoes. The babies seemed to sense when she was most tired and would kick relentlessly, making sleep impossible, even when she had time for it. But she worked. She mopped floors until they gleamed. She emptied trash bins and scrubbed toilets and wiped down surfaces. She moved through the empty office building like a ghost, invisible to the people who would occupy these spaces during the day. People who would never think about who cleaned up after them. She slept for 3 hours when she got home, then forced herself up and went looking for a second job. Because one minimum wage job wasn't enough to cover rent and food and medical bills and everything 3 babies would need. She found work as a receptionist at Hartwell Legal Group, a mid-sized law firm that needed someone to answer phones and greet clients. The office manager, a woman named Patricia, seemed doubtful. "You have any experience?" "I was in law school," Andrea said, which was technically true. She'd completed 1 semester before running out of money. "Why'd you leave?" Andrea's hand moved to her belly, an unconscious gesture. Patricia's eyes followed the movement. "I see," Patricia said, her voice neutral. "The position pays $9 an hour. You'll need to dress professionally. Can you start Monday?" Andrea could have cried with relief. Instead, she nodded and smiled. Monday's perfect. The schedule was brutal. Work at Hartwell from 9 until 5, rush home for a few hours of sleep, then head to Pemberton Tower for the night shift. She'd sleep for 3 hours in the morning, then start the cycle again. Her body screamed for rest. The doctors warned her she was pushing too hard. High-risk pregnancy, they said. Triplets required rest, required care, required someone to take care of her. Andrea nodded and ignored them. She had no choice. There was no one to take care of her, and rest didn't pay bills. The months crawled by in a blur of exhaustion. Andrea's body swelled and ached, carrying the weight of 3 growing lives while she cleaned office buildings and answered phones. She ate cheap food that turned her stomach, instant noodles, day-old bread, whatever she could afford. She wore the same 3 maternity outfits she'd found at Goodwill, washing them in her sink every other night because the laundromat cost too much. She counted every dollar, every cent, stretching each paycheck until it screamed. She had no friends here, no family to call. Her mother had passed when Andrea was young, taken by cancer that had eaten her alive over 2 brutal years. Her father had remarried when Andrea was 13 and moved to another state, starting a new family that didn't have room for the daughter who reminded him of his dead wife. She'd called him once, shortly after learning about the triplets, to tell him he'd be a grandfather. He'd congratulated her politely and said he'd try to visit sometime. He never did. So Andrea was utterly alone, surrounded by millions of people in this city who couldn't see her even when she stood right in front of them. She was invisible, a shadow, a woman society had written off before she'd even failed. There were moments when the loneliness felt like drowning. Late nights, when she'd sit in her tiny apartment after both shifts, one hand on her massive belly, and wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. Wonder if the Vogues family had been right. Wonder if she was being selfish, bringing 3 children into a life of poverty and struggle when she could have made different choices. But then, she'd feel them move. 3 distinct little souls, each with their own rhythm, their own personality already emerging. One was calm, barely stirring except for gentle rolls. One was restless, constantly shifting position, never quite comfortable. One kicked with surprising force, as if already fighting for space in the world, demanding to be acknowledged. "I've got you," Andrea would whisper to them in those dark hours when doubt crept in. "Mommy's got you. I promise. I don't know how we're going to make it, but we will. Because you're worth everything. You're worth more than their money. More than their name, more than all of it combined." It was a promise that became her prayer, her mantra, her reason for existing. In her 8th month, the inevitable happened. Andrea was at her desk at Hartwell Legal, answering a call from a particularly demanding client who was berating her for something that wasn't her fault. The man's voice was loud and angry, and Andrea was doing her best to remain calm and professional when the room began to spin. She gripped the edge of the desk, trying to steady herself, but her vision tunneled to a pinpoint, and her legs gave out beneath her. She woke up on the floor, surrounded by concerned faces. Someone had called an ambulance. Her supervisor, Giles Thornton, stood in the background, his expression more annoyed than worried, already calculating how this disruption would affect his day. At the hospital, the doctors were stern. Severe exhaustion, they said. Dangerously high blood pressure, dehydration, malnutrition. If she didn't rest, if she didn't take care of herself, she could lose the babies. Or worse, "I can't rest," Andrea told them, her voice hoarse. "I have to work. If I don't work, we don't eat. If we don't eat, you won't survive," the doctor interrupted. She was an older woman with kind eyes and no patience for nonsense. "You're 28 years old and your body is shutting down because you're working like a machine instead of a human being. I don't have a choice." Andrea whispered. "There are always choices," the doctor said. But her voice had softened. "There are programs, assistants, people who can help. I've applied for everything," Andrea said tiredly. "I make too much to qualify for most programs. Not much, but too much. And the waiting lists for everything else are months long. By the time I get help, the babies will be here." The doctor was silent for a moment. Then she sighed. "I'm going to write you a note for bed rest, at least for the next month. Show it to your employers. They'll fire me," Andrea said flatly. "Both of them will fire me, and then I'll have nothing." And she was right. When she went back to work the next day with her doctor's note, Giles Thornton looked at it with cold eyes and told her they needed someone who could be reliable. Patricia at the cleaning company said the same thing, though with more sympathy. Both gave her until the end of the week. Andrea worked until her water broke. The babies came early. On a freezing night in November, during her shift at Pemberton Tower, Andrea was mopping the floor of an executive bathroom on the 15th floor when she felt the first contraction. She leaned against the sink, breathing through it, telling herself it was false labor. Just Braxton Hicks. The babies weren't due for another 3 weeks, but then her water broke. A warm gush that pooled around her feet, mixing with the soapy water from her mop bucket. For a moment, she stood there in shock, watching the fluid spread across the white tile floor. Then panic set in. She was alone in the building. It was 2 a.m. Her phone was in her locker 3 floors down. Andrea abandoned her mop and made her way to the emergency phone in the lobby, stopping every few minutes as contractions ripped through her. She called for an ambulance, gave them the address, and then sank onto the floor to wait. The paramedics found her there an hour later, leaning against the security desk, breathing through contractions that were coming faster and faster. They were efficient and professional, loading her onto a stretcher, asking questions she barely heard through the pain. She rode alone to Mercy General Hospital, labored alone for 14 hours, with only nurses cycling in and out, efficient and kind, but ultimately strangers. No one to hold her hand, no one to tell her she was doing well, no one to share the most profound moment of her life. 3 boys entered the world in the early hours of morning. Small but healthy, the doctor said. 5 pounds each, which was good for triplets. Miracles, really, considering everything their mother had been through. They placed the first baby on Andrea's chest, and she forgot about the pain, the exhaustion, the loneliness. She looked down at his tiny face, his eyes squeezed shut, his miniature hands curled into fists, and she fell in love in a way she'd never imagined possible. "Hello, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Hello, my beautiful boy." They brought the second, then the third. The nurse asked what she wanted to name them, and Andrea looked at each tiny face, seeing their personalities already. "Caleb," she whispered, looking at the calmest one, the one who'd barely stirred in her womb. "Isaiah," she said, touching the restless one, the one who was already fussing, unsettled. And Jonah, for the fighter, the one whose strong kick she'd felt for months, the one who even now was waving his fists like he was ready to take on the world. When she finally held all 3 together, arranged carefully in her arms with the help of 2 nurses, Andrea felt something shift inside her. The exhaustion was still there, bone deep and overwhelming. The fear was still there, amplified now because she had 3 tiny, fragile lives depending on her. The impossibility of what lay ahead was still there. Mountains she couldn't yet see how to climb, but underneath it all was something fiercer, something unbreakable, something that burned like a forge. Love. Pure, absolute, unconditional love. She looked down at their tiny faces, their eyes closed, their mouths making suckling motions in their sleep. And she made a vow, not the desperate promise of those dark nights during pregnancy, but something deeper, something forged in the furnace of this moment, something sacred. "No one will ever make you feel unwanted," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No one will ever make you feel like mistakes. You are miracles. You are mine, and I will move heaven and earth before I let anyone hurt you. I will work until my hands bleed. I will sacrifice everything I have and everything I am, because you 3 are worth more than every star in the sky." The hospital social worker came later that morning, clipboard in hand, asking questions about support systems and home situations. She was young, probably fresh out of graduate school, and she looked at Andrea with practiced sympathy, the kind that came from seeing too many situations like this. "Do you have family nearby? Anyone who can help with the babies?" "No." "Friends?" "No." "The father?" "No." The social worker's pen paused on her clipboard. "Any resources at all? Savings, family money?" Andrea looked at the woman steadily, her chin lifted despite her exhaustion. "I have me, and I have them. That's enough." The social worker didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. She left pamphlets about assistance programs and food banks and parenting classes for low-income mothers, her heels clicking away down the hospital corridor. Already moving on to the next case, the next struggling mother, the next impossible situation. Andrea stayed in the hospital for 2 days, learning to nurse 3 babies, to change 3 sets of diapers, to function on even less sleep than she'd had before. The nurses were kind, teaching her tricks, how to tandem feed by propping one baby with pillows while nursing the other 2, how to tell the babies apart by the tiny differences in their features, how to survive on love and coffee and determination. When it was time to leave, Andrea dressed her boys in the only outfits she'd been able to afford, simple onesies from the dollar store. She called a taxi because the bus didn't allow car seats, and even if it did, she couldn't manage 3 carriers on public transportation. The ride home cost $40, almost all the money she had left. Back in her tiny apartment, Andrea set up the 3 cribs she'd bought second-hand. They barely fit in the small space. She'd had to get rid of what little furniture she had, the wobbly chairs, the small table, just to make room. Now her home consisted of a mattress on the floor, 3 cribs, and a hot plate. That first night alone with them was the longest of her life. They cried in rotation, as if they'd planned it, never giving her more than 45 minutes of sleep at a time. She walked circles in her tiny room, bouncing one baby while the other 2 screamed from their cribs, her body aching from childbirth. Her mind fuzzy with exhaustion so profound it felt like being underwater. There were moments she wanted to scream too, moments she wanted to give up, to call someone, to admit she couldn't do this. But there was no one to call. No rescue coming. No help on the way. Just her and 3 tiny humans who needed her to be everything: mother, father, provider, protector. So she kept walking, kept feeding, kept changing diapers and singing lullabies in a voice cracked from overuse. Kept existing minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day. The hospital bill arrived in the mail 1 week later. $47,000. Andrea stared at the number until it stopped making sense, until it became just shapes on paper rather than an impossible debt. She had $320 in her bank account and 2 weeks until rent was due. She filed the bill in a drawer and closed it. Some problems were too big to solve immediately. Some mountains had to be climbed one step at a time, and right now she couldn't even see the peak through the clouds. That night, after finally getting all 3 boys to sleep simultaneously for the first time, Andrea sat on the floor between their cribs. She was crying again, but differently this time. Not from despair or fear or exhaustion, though all of those things were present. She was crying because despite everything, the poverty and loneliness and overwhelming impossibility of her situation, she had never felt more complete. She looked at Caleb, peaceful in sleep, his face angelic. Isaiah, even now fidgeting in his dreams, one tiny fist opening and closing. Jonah, one arm raised as if ready to fight the world, even in his sleep. "We're going to make it," she whispered into the darkness. "I don't know how, but we will. Because you 3 are worth every struggle, every sacrifice, every impossible moment. You're worth everything I've lost and everything I'll never have. You're worth it all." And she meant it with every fiber of her being, across town, in a mansion surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns. Adam Voges stood in his study, staring at a contract his lawyers had drawn up. Papers that legally severed any connection between him and the woman he'd hired as a surrogate. Papers that declared him free of any responsibility for whatever children might have been born. Sophia had already signed, her signature a careless scrawl. His parents had witnessed with satisfaction. All that remained was his signature, and this chapter of their lives would be closed forever. He picked up the pen, put it down, picked it up again. Somewhere in the city, 3 babies had been born. His sons, though he'd never claim them. His blood, though he'd never acknowledge it. 3 lives he'd chosen to erase before they'd even drawn breath. He signed the papers with a hand that trembled slightly, his signature not quite as firm as usual. Told himself it was the right thing, the only thing that made sense, the necessary thing, the practical thing. His mother smiled when she saw the signature. "You've done the right thing, darling. Now we can all move forward." But that night, for reasons he couldn't explain, Adam didn't sleep. He stood at his bedroom window, looking out over the glittering city, and wondered if somewhere out there, Andrea Moreau was looking at the same stars. He wondered if the babies had been born yet. He wondered if they looked like him. He wondered, and the wondering felt sharp as broken glass lodged in his chest. His conscience, long dormant, began to wake. Chapter 3. 3 exits. 0 apologies. The first 3 years of the boys' lives passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless days. Andrea learned to function on exhaustion so profound it became her normal state. She learned that a person could keep going long after they thought they'd reached their limit, that love could fuel the body when food and rest were insufficient. She found work again when the boys were 3 months old. A different cleaning company that didn't ask too many questions. She strapped the babies to her chest in carriers and cleaned houses during the day, moving from room to room with 3 infants sleeping against her. The clients never knew. She was invisible to them anyway, just another cleaning woman they barely glanced at. By the time the boys were 2, she'd found more stable work at Hartwell Legal Group again. They'd been desperate for someone and hadn't checked if she'd worked there before. This time, she kept her head down, worked harder than anyone else, and proved herself indispensable. She was the first one in every morning and the last to leave every evening. Her babysitter was Mrs. Okoye, an elderly woman from Nigeria who lived in the same building and watched the boys for rates Andrea could barely afford. But Mrs. Okoye was kind, and the boys loved her. And Andrea had learned that sometimes you took what you could get and were grateful for it, until the morning Mrs. Okoye fell and broke her hip. Andrea got the call at work. The hospital, the surgery, the recovery time, at least 8 weeks. Andrea's carefully constructed life collapsed in an instant. She had no backup plan, no family to call, no friends who could help. Every other babysitter she'd contacted was either too expensive or had no space for triplets. That morning, she brought the boys to work. They were 3 years old, well behaved for their age, and Andrea had prepared activities to keep them quiet. She settled them in the break room with coloring books and toys, whispering firm instructions about staying quiet and not leaving the room. Then she returned to her desk, her heart pounding, praying no one would notice. For 2 hours it worked. The boys colored and played quietly, occasionally coming to the doorway to check that their mother was still there. Andrea would wave and blow kisses, then redirect them back to their activities. Then Rowan Ashford arrived. He was a senior partner at the firm, a man who wore suits that cost more than Andrea made in a month and who treated support staff like they were barely human. He'd never spoken directly to Andrea before, had never even seemed to notice her existence, but he noticed the children. Andrea was at the reception desk when she heard his voice, loud and incredulous, coming from the break room. Her blood turned to ice. She abandoned her post and rushed to the break room, where she found Rowan standing in the doorway, staring at her sons with undisguised disgust. "Whose children are these?" he demanded. "Mine," Andrea said, stepping protectively in front of her boys. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Ashford. My babysitter had an emergency, and I had no one else." "This is a law firm, not a daycare," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her worn dress, her tired face, her hands clutching protectively at her sons. "Though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Women like you always have excuses." Andrea felt Caleb's small hand slip into hers. Isaiah had started to cry. Jonah stood in front of his brothers, his little face set in defiance, even though he couldn't understand what was happening. "They'll be quiet," Andrea said, hating the pleading in her voice. "I'll make sure they don't disturb anyone. I just need today and then I'll figure something else out." Rowan laughed, a cruel sound that made Caleb flinch. "Do you know what clients think when they see children running around a professional office? They think we're unprofessional. They think we're a joke." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to something more vicious. "And do you know what I think? I think no man will ever want a woman dragging 3 children around like luggage. You're damaged goods, and you're making this firm look bad by association." The words hit like physical blows. Andrea felt her face burn with humiliation, but underneath the shame was something else, a rage so pure and hot it took her breath away. She looked at this man in his expensive suit, this man who had everything and valued nothing, this man who thought cruelty was a privilege his wealth afforded him. She looked at her sons, holding on to her, their small faces confused and frightened, and she made a choice. "Then I suppose I'll stop making you look bad," Andrea said, her voice steady despite the fury coursing through her. She knelt down and began gathering her son's things, stuffing crayons and coloring books into her bag with shaking hands. "What are you doing?" Rowan asked. Andrea stood, a child holding each hand, her bag over her shoulder. She looked Rowan Ashford in the eye, and when she spoke, her voice was steel. "I'm finding a man who sees my children as blessings, not baggage. And I'm leaving a place where my boys would learn that money makes cruelty acceptable." She walked past him without another word, her head high, her sons walking beside her. She didn't stop at her desk to collect her things. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She simply walked out of Hartwell Legal Group with her sons, knowing she'd just quit the only stable job she'd had in years. On the sidewalk outside, reality hit her. No job, no money, no plan. Caleb was crying now, confused by the sudden change. Isaiah clung to her leg. Jonah kept asking, "Where are we going, Mama?" Andrea knelt down and pulled all three boys into a hug. "We're going home," she said, "and Mama's going to find a better job, a better place, because you three deserve better than that." She didn't cry until that night, after the boys were asleep. When the weight of what she'd done finally crashed over her, she found another job within a week, working at Whitmore Hale Accounting. The pay was slightly better, and the office manager seemed reasonable. Andrea was determined to make this work. She could not afford another mistake. For 6 months it was fine. She was punctual, efficient, never complained. Mrs. Okoye recovered and returned to babysitting. Life found a rhythm again, precarious but manageable. Then Isaiah got sick. He woke up one morning with a fever so high his small body shook with chills. Andrea called the doctor, gave him medicine, monitored him constantly, but she also had to go to work. She had no sick days, no safety net. If she didn't work, she didn't get paid. She brought Isaiah with her, hoping the fever would break, hoping he'd sleep in the break room, hoping no one would notice. She settled him on the couch with blankets and water, checking on him every 15 minutes. She was 5 minutes late, clocking in. Her manager, Dinah Pruitt, was waiting at her desk when Andrea rushed in, breathless and apologetic. "You're late," Dinah said flatly. "I'm so sorry. My son is sick, and I had to—" "You're late," Dinah repeated. She reached across Andrea's desk and grabbed her timesheet, then threw it on the floor. The paper fluttered down, landing at Andrea's feet. "You mothers are always full of excuses, always some drama, some crisis, some reason why the rules don't apply to you." Andrea stared at the timesheet on the floor. 5 minutes. She'd been 5 minutes late. "Pick it up," Dinah said, her voice hard. Andrea looked at this woman who'd probably never worried about how to feed her children, who'd probably never had to choose between a sick child and a paycheck, who stood there radiating contempt for circumstances she couldn't begin to understand. Andrea bent down and picked up the timesheet, but instead of putting it back on her desk, she folded it carefully and placed it in front of Dinah. "I quit," Andrea said quietly. "What?" "I quit. I will not work for someone who throws things at me. I will not teach my sons that it's acceptable to be treated like garbage." Andrea turned and walked to the break room where Isaiah lay sleeping, gathered him carefully in her arms, and walked out of Whitmore Hale Accounting without looking back. Dinah called after her, something about proper notice and professionalism, but Andrea didn't hear. She heard only Isaiah's labored breathing against her chest, felt only his feverish warmth, knew only that she'd made the right choice, even if it was the harder one. Silence is the loudest resignation. The third job came 6 months later at an upscale event company called Prestige Affairs. They planned weddings and corporate events for wealthy clients. Andrea's role was simple: assist with setups, coordinate with vendors, basically do whatever needed doing. The pay was good, the best she'd had, and for a while things seemed stable until the Grantley wedding. It was a massive affair, the kind where money flowed like water. Andrea spent the day running between venues, confirming details, solving problems. She was professional and efficient, barely visible as she made everything run smoothly. During a brief break, she stood in the corner of the reception hall, making notes on her checklist. She was near a group of wealthy women, guests at the wedding, who were gossiping over champagne. "Did you see the staff?" one woman said, her voice carrying. "They're really scraping the bottom of the barrel these days." "That one over there," another woman said, and Andrea realized with a sinking feeling they were talking about her. "I heard she has 3 children. No husband, can you imagine?" The first woman laughed. She probably had those kids to trap some rich man. Didn't work out, I guess. Women like that, a third woman said, this one wearing a diamond necklace that could have paid Andrea's rent for a year. They think a baby is a meal ticket. It's pathetic, really. Andrea's hand stilled on her clipboard. The women continued talking, oblivious to or uncaring that she could hear every word. They speculated about her life, her choices, her character, treating her existence like entertainment for their boring afternoon. She could have ignored it, could have finished her shift, collected her paycheck, pretended she hadn't heard, could have swallowed the humiliation like she'd swallowed so many others. But she was tired. So tired of being invisible except when people wanted someone to look down on. Tired of working herself to exhaustion for people who saw her as less than human. Tired of teaching her sons that enduring abuse was the same as being strong. Andrea walked over to the table where the event company had set up their coordination station. She found her supervisor, a man named Gregory, and handed him her clipboard. "I need to leave," she said. "Leave." "Andrea, we're in the middle of an event." "I quit," she said simply. "Effective immediately." "You can't just quit in the middle of a wedding." "I just did." Andrea removed her company badge and placed it on the table. "You'll figure it out. You always do." She walked out of the reception hall, her head high, ignoring Gregory's sputtering protests. She walked past the wealthy guests with their expensive clothes and cheap hearts. She walked out into the afternoon sunshine and breathed deeply, feeling lighter than she had in months. 3 jobs lost. 3 times she'd chosen dignity over desperation. 3 times she'd walked away rather than accept being treated as less than human. That evening, after putting the boys to bed, Andrea sat at her small table and reviewed her finances. She had enough savings to last maybe 6 weeks if she was careful. She'd have to find another job quickly. Caleb appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Mama, are you sad?" Andrea smiled and opened her arms. He climbed into her lap, followed quickly by Isaiah and Jonah, who never wanted to be left out. "No, baby," she said, holding all 3 close. "Mama's not sad. Mama's just figuring things out." "Are we poor?" Isaiah asked with the blunt honesty of a young child. Andrea considered lying, then decided against it. "Yes," she said gently, "we don't have a lot of money, but we have something much more important." "What?" Jonah asked. "We have each other," Andrea said. "And we have love, and we have self-respect. Do you know what that means?" 3 small heads shook. "It means we don't let anyone make us feel small. It means we're worth more than money can buy. It means we're enough, just as we are." "But why did those people say mean things?" Caleb asked. He'd been there at the first job, had heard Rowan Ashford's cruel words. Even if he hadn't fully understood them, Andrea chose her words carefully. "Some people think money makes them better than others, but it doesn't. Money is just paper. What makes a person good is how they treat people, especially people who can't do anything for them." "We're good people?" Isaiah asked. "The best people," Andrea said fiercely. "You 3 are the best people I've ever known." That night, after the boys finally slept, Andrea did something she rarely allowed herself. She cried. Not from despair, but from exhaustion. From the weight of carrying everything alone, from the loneliness that never quite went away. But alongside the tears was something else, a fierce pride that she'd taught her sons an important lesson today. That dignity mattered more than paychecks, that they were worth fighting for, even when the fight meant losing. 3 jobs lost, 3 lessons learned. The world punishes women for loving too fiercely, but Andrea would rather be punished than diminished. She'd find another job. She always did. And maybe, just maybe, one day her sons would be grown and would remember that their mother never let anyone make her bow. That would be worth more than all the wealth in the world. Chapter 4. The proposals she refused despite the struggles, Despite the poverty and the exhaustion and the endless uphill battle of single motherhood, Andrea never taught her sons to hate. Every night, after dinner in their tiny apartment, she would gather all three boys and tell them stories. Stories about a father who existed somewhere, who carried their eyes and their smile, who had loved them once but got lost along the way. "Is Daddy ever coming back?" Jonah asked one night. He was 5 now, old enough to notice that other children had fathers, old enough to feel the absence. Andrea's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't know, baby. But I know this. Whatever happened, it wasn't your fault. You three are perfect, and anyone who can't see that is the one who's lost, not you." "Do you hate him?" Caleb asked quietly. He was the thoughtful one, the one who noticed everything. Andrea was silent for a moment, considering her answer carefully. Did she hate Adam Voges? She'd tried to. God knows she'd tried. But hate required energy she couldn't spare, and teaching her sons to carry bitterness would only poison their hearts. "No," she said finally. "I don't hate him. I'm sad for him. Because he's missing the most wonderful thing in the world, watching you three grow up." It was during these years that the men appeared in her life. 3 of them at different times, each offering a kind of salvation she desperately needed but couldn't accept. The first was Terence Bellamy. She met him at the community center where she'd enrolled the boys in an after-school program. Terence was a teacher there, patient and kind, with an easy smile that made everyone around him feel safe. He was gentle with the boys, learning their individual personalities, never mixing them up the way most people did. "Isaiah's the explorer," Terence said one day, watching the boys play. "Always pushing boundaries. And Jonah's the protector, keeping his brothers safe. But Caleb's the observer. He sees everything." Andrea looked at this man who'd taken the time to truly see her sons and felt something soften in her chest. Something she'd thought had died in that mansion when Adam Voges chose silence over courage. Terence started walking her home after pickup, carrying her bags, telling her stories that made her laugh. Actual, genuine laughter that felt like a foreign language she'd forgotten how to speak. He brought extra food, always casual about it. "Oh, I made too much again. Would you mind helping me out?" The boys adored him. They'd light up when he arrived, showing him their drawings, their schoolwork, telling him about their days with the kind of enthusiasm they usually reserved for her. 6 months after they met, Terence asked her to dinner. A real dinner, he specified. Not the community center, not with the boys, just the 2 of them. Andrea's first instinct was to refuse. She had no money for a babysitter, no appropriate clothes, no energy left after working and mothering all day. But Terence had already thought of everything. His sister would watch the boys. It was just a casual place. She should come as she was. The dinner was lovely. Terence was attentive without being overwhelming, funny without being crude, interested in her thoughts and opinions like they mattered. For a few hours, Andrea felt like a person again, instead of just a mother, just a worker, just someone struggling to survive. When he drove her home, Terence walked her to her door. In the dim hallway light, he took her hand. "Andrea," he said, "I know life has been hard for you. I don't know all the details, and I don't need to. What I know is that you're the strongest, most amazing woman I've ever met. And those boys, they're incredible because you've raised them to be." Andrea's throat tightened. "Terence, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm falling in love with you. I love your boys. I want to be there for all of you, if you'll let me. I know it's soon, but I also know that when something's right, you don't let it go." He pulled out a small box. Not expensive, but thoughtful, a simple ring with 3 small stones. "One for each of them," he said, "because they're part of you, and I love all of it." Andrea looked at this good man offering her everything she needed: stability, partnership, a father for her sons. She thought about how much easier life would be, how the boys would have someone to play catch with, to teach them how to fix things, to show them what a good man looked like. And she wanted to say yes. God, she wanted to. but when she opened her mouth, different words came out. "Terence, you deserve a woman who can love you fully. I'm still healing. I don't know if I'll ever stop healing. I can wait," he said quickly. "I can be patient." "No," Andrea said softly, and her heart was breaking even as she said it. "You deserve someone who's whole, who can give you everything. I'm not there yet. I might never be there, and it wouldn't be fair to you or to my boys to pretend otherwise." Terence's face fell, but he nodded. "If you change your mind—" "I won't," Andrea said, and she meant it. "But thank you. Thank you for seeing us, for caring. You're going to make someone very happy someday." She went inside before she could change her mind, before the loneliness could override her better judgment. The boys were asleep, and Andrea sat in the darkness, crying for what she'd given up and proud of, herself for knowing it was the right choice. The second proposal came 2 years later. Dr. David Okoro was the physician who treated Jonah after a nasty fall at the playground. While stitching up her son's forehead, he'd been calm and reassuring, talking to Jonah about superheroes and making the frightened little boy smile. Afterward, in the hallway, he'd turned to Andrea. "You're doing an amazing job with them. 3 boys that age, all well-behaved and polite. That's rare." Andrea had laughed tiredly. "You caught them on a good day." But David had smiled like he didn't believe her. "I don't think so. I think you're remarkable." He'd asked for her number to follow up on Jonah's care. The follow-up calls had turned into conversations. The conversations had turned into coffee meetings. The coffee meetings had turned into something more. David was different from Terence. Where Terence had been gentle and patient, David was intense and passionate. He was a widower. His wife lost to cancer 3 years prior, and he understood grief in ways Terence never could. "I know what it's like," David told her one night. They were sitting on a bench outside the hospital where he worked, watching the city lights. "To lose someone, to have to keep going when part of you wants to stop, to raise children while your heart is still broken. It's not the same," Andrea said. "Your wife died. My situation is different." "Pain is pain," David said, "and strength is strength. I see you, Andrea. I see how hard you fight, how much you love those boys. I see the strongest woman I've ever met." When David proposed, it was different from Terence's proposal. There was no ring, no grand gesture. They were in her apartment after he'd helped her fix a leaking pipe under the sink. The boys were in bed, and they sat on her worn couch drinking cheap wine. "Marry me?" David said suddenly. Andrea nearly choked on her wine. "What? Marry me?" he repeated. "I know it's fast. I know it's crazy. But I'm 43 years old, Andrea. I've learned that life is too short to waste time pretending you don't know what you want. And I want you. I want those 3 amazing boys. I want to build a life together. David, I have a good job. A house with enough bedrooms for everyone. I can give you security, stability. I can give those boys a father." He took her hands. "I can love you, Andrea. I already do." It was tempting. God, it was tempting. To have someone share the burden. To have help with homework and bedtime and bills. To wake up next to someone who chose her, who wanted her despite everything. But Andrea knew something David didn't. She knew that marriage as rescue wasn't the same as marriage as partnership. She knew that needing someone wasn't the same as choosing them freely. She knew that she would resent him eventually for saving her, and he would resent her for needing saving. "You deserve a woman who can love you fully," Andrea said gently, echoing the words she'd said to Terence. "I don't need saving, David. I need space. I need time. Maybe I need to prove to myself that I can make it alone before I can share my life with someone." "That's pride talking," David said, frustrated now. "There's no shame in accepting help." "It's not about shame," Andrea said. "It's about being sure. I won't marry you because you can solve my problems. I'd only marry you if I wanted to share my joys. And right now I don't have enough joy to share." David left angry, though he called the next week to apologize. They remained friends, but the possibility of more had closed like a door that couldn't be reopened. The third proposal was the hardest. Samuel Forge was a construction foreman, a man with calloused hands and an honest face. Andrea met him when he was working on renovations in her building. He'd noticed her struggling up the stairs with groceries and 3 tired boys, and had simply taken the bags from her hands. "Let me help," he'd said, and something about his straightforward kindness had made Andrea's eyes sting with unexpected tears. Samuel started appearing whenever she needed help. A broken lock, a stuck window. He'd show up with tools and a thermos of coffee, fix whatever was broken, and refuse any payment. "I had a daughter once," he told her one day. "Lost her and her mother in a car accident 10 years back. Sometimes I think God puts people in our path for a reason. Maybe I couldn't save them, but I can help you." Samuel was different from Terence and David. He didn't speak of love or romance. He simply showed up day after day, being present in a way that felt revolutionary. The boys loved him. Samuel taught them how to use tools, how to fix things, practical skills Andrea couldn't provide. He took them to ball games and fishing, giving them male attention they desperately needed. When Samuel proposed, it was while teaching Jonah how to hammer a nail straight. "I'd like to adopt them," Samuel said casually, like he was discussing the weather. "The boys, officially, give them my name, be their father legally." Andrea, who'd been watching from the doorway, felt her world tilt. "Samuel, and I'd like to marry you," he continued, still focused on guiding Jonah's small hand. "Not because I'm trying to save you, or because I think you need me, but because over the past year you 4 have become my family, and I'd like to make it official." This was the proposal Andrea almost accepted. Samuel wasn't offering rescue. He was offering partnership. He wasn't promising to solve her problems. He was promising to stand beside her while she solved them herself. She spent a week thinking about it. A week watching Samuel with her boys, seeing how natural it felt, how right. A week imagining what life could be like with someone solid and steady beside her. But in the end, the answer was still no. She told him on a Saturday morning, after he'd made pancakes for the boys and they were playing in the park. "I can't," Andrea said simply. Samuel nodded like he'd expected it. "Why not?" "Because I won't let anyone raise my sons just to prove I'm not alone." Andrea's voice was steady, certain. "I am enough. I need to be enough. And if I marry you, wonderful as you are, I'll always wonder if I did it because I loved you or because I was tired of fighting alone." "Those don't have to be different things," Samuel said quietly. "For me they do," Andrea replied. "I need to know I can do this by myself. I need my boys to see that their mother is complete, whole, sufficient, that she doesn't need a man to validate her or save her or make her life worthwhile." Samuel was quiet for a long time. Then he smiled, sad but understanding. "You're right. You are enough. You're more than enough. Those boys are lucky to have you. Will you stay in our lives?" Andrea asked. "Not as a husband, but as a friend?" "Always," Samuel promised, and he meant it. 3 proposals. 3 good men offering love and security and partnership. 3 times Andrea chose herself, chose the hard road of independence over the easier path of companionship. That night, after the boys were asleep, Caleb appeared in her doorway. He was almost 6 now, growing tall and perceptive. "Mom, why don't you have a boyfriend?" Andrea smiled and patted the space beside her. Caleb climbed up, followed by Isaiah and Jonah, who'd been listening from their room. "Because I have you 3, Andrea said. "And you're enough for me, but don't you get lonely?" Isaiah asked. Andrea considered this. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But being alone isn't the same as being lonely. I have you boys. I have my self-respect. I have a life I've built with my own hands. That's worth more than anything. When we grow up," Jonah said seriously, "we're gonna take care of you, so you're never alone." Andrea pulled all 3 close, her heart so full it hurt. "You already take care of me," she whispered. Just by being exactly who you are, she chose herself, again and again, and in doing so, she taught her sons the most important lesson they would ever learn, that love shouldn't require you to become less, that partnership should add to your life rather than define it. that being enough for yourself is the foundation upon which everything else is built. She became unbreakable, and her sons, watching her refuse to be saved, learned what true strength looked like. Chapter 5. The Mall, the Mirror, the Reckoning. 5 years had passed since Andrea Moreau walked out of the Vosges mansion. 5 years that felt simultaneously like a lifetime and like yesterday. 5 years of grinding poverty, slowly, painfully giving way to modest stability. She'd finally found her footing, landing a position as a paralegal at Trenton Locke, a respected firm that valued her work ethic and sharp mind. The pay wasn't lavish, but it was enough. Enough for a slightly better apartment with 2 actual bedrooms, instead of 1 room for everyone. Enough for new shoes when the boys needed them, instead of second-hand ones that hurt their feet. Enough to sometimes breathe without calculating every dollar, every cent, every impossible choice. The boys had grown into themselves in ways that still amazed Andrea every single day. Caleb, at 5, was thoughtful and gentle, with an ability to sense conflict before it erupted and diffuse it with quiet wisdom. He had a way of seeing through to what people really meant, understanding the emotions beneath their words. Isaiah was restless and curious, a perpetual motion machine who asked endless questions about everything he encountered. Why was the sky blue? Where did shadows go at night? How did birds know which way to fly? His mind worked constantly, always seeking connections, always hungry for understanding. Jonah was fierce and protective, quick to defend anyone being treated unfairly. Once he'd gotten in trouble for confronting a bigger boy who'd been picking on a smaller child. Andrea had tried to explain that violence wasn't the answer, but Jonah had looked at her with those intense eyes and said, but somebody had to help him. Mama, they were beautiful children, and Andrea knew it wasn't just maternal bias. Strangers stopped to comment on them constantly, their bright eyes that seemed to take in everything. Their polite manners that stood out in a world where children often went unnoticed, their obvious bond that made people smile. The 3 of them moved through the world like a unit, finishing each other's sentences, defending each other instinctively, loving each other with the kind of devotion that comes from shared struggle. They looked like their father, though Andrea never said it aloud. Every time she looked at them, she saw Adam Voges staring back at her. They had his strong jawline that was still softened by childhood, but would become prominent as they aged. They had his intense gaze that could be intimidating or compelling, depending on the emotion behind it. They had his hands that would someday be large and capable. Hands that could build or destroy, depending on the man who wielded them. Sometimes, late at night when the boys were asleep, Andrea would stand in their doorway and watch them breathe. Watch Caleb's peaceful sleep, Isaiah's restless turning, Jonah's protective posture even in dreams. One arm always flung out as if shielding his brothers from invisible threats. And she would think about the man who'd given them life but not love. The man who'd contributed DNA but not devotion. The man who'd planted seeds but refused to water them. She'd built a good life for them despite everything. But sometimes Andrea wondered what it cost her to carry both mother and father inside herself. To be everything they needed when one person couldn't possibly be enough. To watch other families with 2 parents and feel that familiar ache of absence, of incompleteness that she'd learned to ignore but never quite forget. It was a Saturday in October when Andrea decided to take them to Grandview Luxe Mall. The decision hadn't been made lightly. The mall represented everything they usually couldn't afford. Overpriced stores, expensive food courts, the kind of casual luxury that families with money took for granted. But the boys had worked so hard. Perfect reports from school, all 3 of them. Caleb had won a reading award. Isaiah had placed in the science fair. Jonah had been named most valuable player on his little league team. They deserved something special. They deserved to feel, even for an afternoon, like they belonged in places designed for people with money. A treat, she'd told them that morning, watching their faces light up with excitement. Because you 3 are the most amazing kids in the world, and I want to celebrate you. They could each pick out new shoes, real new shoes, not thrift store finds. and maybe they'd get ice cream afterward if the budget allowed. Andrea had been saving for weeks, tucking away a few dollars here and there from her paycheck, building up to this moment of small extravagance that would feel like luxury to children who'd learned to expect very little. The boys were excited, walking beside her through the gleaming corridors of the mall. Caleb held her hand. Isaiah darted ahead and back, unable to contain his energy. Jonah stayed close to her other side, always watchful. They were heading toward the shoe store when Caleb stopped suddenly. "Mama, why is that man staring at us?" Andrea looked up. The mall's center atrium was bustling with weekend shoppers, hundreds of people moving through the space. But across the fountain, standing absolutely still, was a man in an expensive suit, Adam Voges. Time fractured. The noise of the mall faded to a distant hum. Andrea's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She hadn't seen him in 5 years, hadn't heard his voice, hadn't allowed herself to think about him except in the darkest hours when memory was unavoidable. He looked older, thinner. There were lines on his face that hadn't been there before. His hair showed grey at the temples, but his eyes, those eyes were the same, and they were locked on her son's with an expression of absolute devastation. Andrea felt her body move on instinct, placing herself between Adam and her children. Her hand tightened on Caleb's. "Boys, stay close to me." "Who is that man?" Isaiah asked, his natural curiosity overriding caution. Before Andrea could answer, Adam moved. He crossed the atrium in long strides, pushing through crowds, his face a mask of something between hope and horror. He stopped 10 feet away, as if an invisible barrier prevented him from coming closer. "Andrea," he breathed. His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the mall's ambient noise. She said nothing, just stood there, 3 boys arranged around her like planets orbiting the sun, all of them watching this strange man who looked at them like he was seeing ghosts. Adam's gaze moved from Andrea to the boys, studying each face with desperate intensity. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Are they—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The boys looked at their mother, confused. Caleb tugged her hand. "Mama?" Andrea sat down beside them on the couch, bringing herself to their level. Her hands were steady as she smoothed Caleb's hair, adjusted Isaiah's collar, touched Jonah's cheek. "Remember when we talked about how sometimes people make choices they regret?" she said softly. "And how those choices follow them forever." 3 small heads nodded. "Well, this man made a choice once." Andrea stood, her eyes finally meeting Adam's. The boys flanked her, sensing tension they couldn't name. He chose his comfort over their existence. He chose pride over possibility. He chose fear over love. "Andrea, please," Adam's voice cracked. "I didn't know. I mean, I knew, but I never thought." He looked at the boys again, Caleb's thoughtful eyes, Isaiah's curious expression, Jonah's protective stance in front of his brothers. "They're so big." "Children do tend to grow," Andrea said, her voice perfectly calm, perfectly cold. "Especially when you're not there to see it." Adam took a step forward. Jonah immediately stepped in front of his brothers, his small body rigid with protective instinct. Adam stopped, devastated by this tiny mirror image of himself, acting as barrier between him and his brothers. "Can we talk?" Adam asked. "Please, just for a moment. We have nothing to say to each other," Andrea replied. "You made your choice 5 years ago in a mansion filled with people who valued money more than humanity. I made mine on the steps outside. We're both living with the consequences." "I was wrong," Adam said, and tears were streaming down his face now, unashamed in the middle of this crowded mall. "I was so wrong. I've thought about you every day. Wondered if the babies were born, if they were okay, if you survived." "We survived," Andrea interrupted. "No thanks to you. We survived poverty and humiliation and exhaustion that should have killed me. We survived because these 3 boys deserved better than the life you condemned them to. We survived because I loved them more than I feared suffering." "I want to make it right," Adam said desperately. "Please, let me make it right." Andrea's laugh was sharp, cutting. "You think you can make it right? You wanted me to erase them. You stood silent while your family called them mistakes, complications, problems. You signed papers severing your rights to them before they'd drawn their first breath. She placed her hands on her son's shoulders. These boys are 5 years old, Adam. 5. Do you know what that means? It means thousands of mornings I woke up alone to feed them. Thousands of nights I put them to bed, wondering if I could keep going one more day. 5 birthdays. 5 first days of school. 5 years of skinned knees and bad dreams and homework and growing that you missed because you were too weak to stand up to your family. I know, Adam whispered. I know, and I can't. You can't take it back, Andrea finished. No amount of money, no apology, no regret can give them back the father they should have had. No guilt you feel now can erase the choice you made then. She knelt again, this time wrapping her arms around all 3 boys. She looked up at Adam, still standing there, broken and shaking, and her voice when she spoke was quiet but absolute. They are what you wanted to destroy. Then she stood, took her son's hands, and walked away. Walked past him without another glance, through the mall, out into the parking lot, into their old car that rattled but ran. Behind her, Adam Voges stood frozen in the center of the atrium. Shoppers flowed around him like water around stone. Someone bumped into him, muttered an apology, moved on. He couldn't feel it. Couldn't feel anything except the crushing weight of what he'd just seen. 3 boys. His boys, beautiful and healthy and loved. 3 lives that existed not because of him, but in spite of him. 3 chances he'd thrown away because he'd been too cowardly to claim them. His legs gave out. He collapsed against the fountain's edge, his expensive suit getting wet, his hands shaking so violently he had to press them against his thighs. A security guard approached asking if he needed help, but Adam couldn't form words. He'd known abstractly that he'd made a mistake. He'd signed those papers 5 years ago with trembling hands. He'd wondered, over the years, if the babies had been born healthy, if Andrea had survived, if somewhere out there his children existed, but knowing abstractly and seeing reality were entirely different things. They were real. They weren't abstractions or possibilities. They were 3 distinct human beings with personalities and faces and voices. They existed in the world, breathed the same air, walked the same earth. And they had no idea who he was. Worse, they didn't need to know. They had each other. They had their mother, a woman who'd chosen suffering over abandoning them. They were whole and complete without him. He was the empty space. He was the absence. He was nothing to them, except a cautionary tale their mother might tell about choices and consequences. Adam didn't know how long he sat there. Eventually, the security guard returned with a manager. Concerned voices asked questions he didn't answer. Someone recognized him. Isn't that Adam Voges? And whispers spread like ripples. Finally, Adam stood. He walked through the mall on legs that felt disconnected from his body. Drove home in a car he didn't remember getting into. Entered a house that suddenly felt cavernous and cold. Sophia found him in his study an hour later, still in his wet suit, staring at nothing. "What happened to you?" she asked, more annoyed than concerned. Adam looked at his wife. Really looked at her. At the woman who'd had an affair, who'd demanded a surrogate, who'd wanted the prestige of motherhood without the inconvenience. The woman who'd smiled when they demanded Andrea abort those children. "I saw them," he said. "Saw who?" "My sons." Sophia's face hardened. "Those aren't your sons." "You signed papers." "I saw them," Adam repeated. 3 boys, 5 years old. They have my eyes, my hands, my... His voice broke. "They're perfect. They're alive and perfect, and I threw them away." "Adam, stop this. You're being melodramatic." "Get out," Adam said quietly. "Excuse me. Get out of my study. Get out of my house. Get out of my life." Adam stood, and something in his face made Sophia take a step back. "You were right 5 years ago. I shouldn't have had children with you, but I was wrong to agree to what we did. We destroyed something precious, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life knowing that." Sophia left, slamming the door. Adam heard her on the phone minutes later, complaining to her mother about his breakdown. He didn't care. He stood at his window, looking out over the city, and wondered where in those millions of lights Andrea and his sons were. Were they home now? Were the boys asking about the man who'd stared at them? Was Andrea holding them, explaining away his presence? Or had they already forgotten him, the way you forget a strange face in a crowd? Adam wept then, truly wept, for the first time in years. Not quiet tears, but deep, racking sobs that came from a place he'd kept locked away his entire life. He cried for the children he'd never held, for the years he'd missed, for the woman he'd betrayed, for the man he'd failed to be, and somewhere across the city, in a small apartment, Andrea Moreau held her sons and answered their questions. Why was that man crying, Mama? Because he finally saw what he lost, baby. Are we gonna see him again? I don't know. But it doesn't matter. We have each other, and that's enough. And it was. That night, the crack in Adam Voger's armor became a chasm, and everything he'd built his life upon began to crumble. Chapter 6. The 5 rejections Adam Voger's became a man possessed. The days following the mall encounter passed in a blur of sleepless nights and desperate searching. He hired a private investigator within hours, spending more money in one afternoon than most people earned in a year. Find her, he demanded. Find Andrea Moreau. Find my sons. The report came back quickly. Her address, her workplace, her daily routine, laid out in clinical detail. The investigator had been thorough, perhaps too thorough. The report noted that she worked as a paralegal at Trenton Lock, made a modest salary, lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood. The boys attended Roosevelt Elementary. They walked to school most mornings. Andrea packed their lunches the night before. Adam read every detail, memorizing information that felt simultaneously invasive and essential. These were his children. He had a right to know, didn't he? The investigator had included photographs. Andrea walking with the boys, laughing at something Jonah said. The 3 of them at a park, climbing on playground equipment. Caleb reading a book on a bench while his brothers played. Isaiah chasing pigeons with pure joy on his face. Adam stared at these stolen moments of a life he wasn't part of, and the ache in his chest grew until he thought it might kill him. His mother noticed his distraction. "You've been impossible lately," Celestine said over dinner at the family estate. It was just the 2 of them. His father was away, and Sophia had moved into the guest house during their separation. "I saw her," Adam said abruptly. "Andrea and the children." Celestine's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "What, at Grandview Mall, 3 boys." "My sons." Adam looked at his mother with eyes that held none of their usual deference. "You told me I was making the right choice, that they would complicate everything. Do you remember? Adam, do you remember?" His voice was sharp enough that Celestine flinched. "Yes, and I stand by that advice. You can't seriously be considering—" "I'm not considering anything. I'm stating a fact. I saw my sons, and they're extraordinary, and you convinced me to throw them away before they were born. I convinced you to protect your future." "I don't have a future," Adam interrupted. "I have money and property and a dying marriage and an empty house. That's not a future. That's a tomb." He left without finishing his meal. Celestine called after him, her voice sharp with authority that no longer moved him. Adam kept walking. The next day he went to Andrea's apartment. It was early evening. The investigator's report said she usually got home around 6. Adam waited in his car, watching the building's entrance with the focus of someone hunting salvation. She appeared at 6:15, the 3 boys trailing behind her, all of them carrying grocery bags that looked too heavy for their small arms. Adam's heart clenched watching them. Jonah was helping Caleb with his bag. Isaiah was trying to carry 2 and almost dropping both. Andrea moved between them, efficient and loving, redistributing weight, smoothing hair, ushering them inside. Adam waited 10 minutes after they disappeared into the building. Then he walked to the entrance, found her apartment number, and climbed stairs that smelled faintly of cooking and old carpet. He stood outside her door for a full minute before knocking. Footsteps inside. Then Andrea's voice, cautious. "Who is it?" "It's Adam. Please, I just want to talk." Silence. Long enough that Adam thought she wouldn't respond. "Then don't go away. Andrea, please. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. You're not entitled to 5 seconds. Her voice came through the door, clear and final. You made your choice. Live with it. I was wrong, Adam said, pressing his palm against the door like he could reach through it. I've thought about nothing else for 5 years. I need to— What you need is irrelevant, Andrea interrupted. You wanted us gone. We're gone. That was the whole point, wasn't it? For us to not exist in your world? I want to make this right. You can't. Some things can't be fixed, Adam. Some choices are permanent. There was a pause. When she spoke again, her voice was softer but no less firm. Real fathers don't appear after 5 years. Real fathers don't abandon their children and then expect forgiveness because guilt got uncomfortable. Go home. Build whatever life you've built without us. We're not yours to reclaim. Please, Adam whispered. Just let me see them. Let me— Mama? A small voice called from inside. Who's at the door? Adam heard Andrea move away, her voice fading as she tended to one of the boys. She didn't return. After 15 minutes, Adam accepted reality and left, his heart splintering with each step down those stairs. First failed reunion. 2 weeks later, Adam tried again. This time, he sent gifts. Not flowers or chocolates for Andrea. He wasn't trying to buy her forgiveness. Instead, he sent things for the boys. Educational toys, carefully selected by a consultant. Art supplies, books. A savings bond for each child, enough to pay for college someday. The packages were wrapped beautifully, delivered by a premium service. Adam waited at home, checking his phone obsessively for some acknowledgement. A text. A call. Anything. The packages came back 3 days later. They were neatly rewrapped, undamaged, with a single note attached in Andrea's precise handwriting. They don't need gold. They needed a father. Adam sat in his study, holding that note, reading it over and over until the words stopped making sense. He'd thought practical help would show good intentions. He'd thought providing for them financially would prove he cared. But Andrea was right. Money was the easy answer. Money required nothing of him except signing checks. It didn't require his time, his presence, his actual self. Second failed reunion. Adam changed tactics. He started appearing at her workplace. It took the investigator 5 minutes to determine Andrea's lunch routine. Every day at 12:30, she'd walk to a small park 3 blocks from her office. She'd bring a packed lunch, always something simple, and sit on the same bench under an oak tree. She'd eat for 20 minutes, then spend the remaining 10 minutes reading. Adam was waiting there when she arrived one Thursday. Andrea stopped when she saw him, her bag frozen halfway open. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she turned to leave. Please, Adam said, standing. I'm not here to harass you. I just want to talk. I'm calling security, Andrea said, reaching for her phone. I'll leave if you want, Adam said quickly. After you hear me out. 3 minutes. That's all. Andrea looked at him with such cold assessment that Adam felt stripped bare. Finally, she sat down on a different bench, 20 feet away. 3 minutes. Then you leave and don't come back. Adam moved to stand near her, not too close. I've spent the last 5 years trying to forget, telling myself I made the practical choice, convincing myself you'd be fine. The children would be fine, everyone would be fine. And then I saw you at the mall and I realized nothing's been fine. Not for me, probably not for you. Your emotional growth isn't my concern, Andrea said. I know. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, Adam's voice cracked. I'm asking for a chance to know them, to be part of their lives, even a small part. I'll do it on your terms. I'll pay support. You think this is about money? Andrea stood, her lunch forgotten. You think support checks and college funds make you a father? Real fathers don't show up after 5 years because they had a moment of conscience. Real fathers are there when it's hard, when there's no applause, no redemption arc, no payoff except the knowledge that you're doing right by your children. I want to be that, Adam said desperately. I want to do right by them now. It's too late for now, Andrea said. Her eyes were bright, but no tears fell. She wouldn't give him that. You had 5 years of nows, and you chose none of them. You don't get to waltz in because you finally looked in the mirror and didn't like what you saw. She walked away without looking back. Adam stood in that park for an hour after she left, watching other people eat their lunches, live their normal lives, unaware that his was falling apart. Third failed reunion. Adam became more desperate. He started trying to help from a distance, convincing himself that action mattered even without acknowledgement. He paid Andrea's rent anonymously for 3 months, working through multiple accounts to hide the source. He had toys and groceries delivered to her building, addressed to the Moreau family, with no return address. He donated to Roosevelt Elementary in the boys' names, enough to renovate their entire playground. Andrea figured it out. By the second month, the rental company manager had mentioned an anonymous benefactor. The toys had arrived on the same day as the grocery delivery. Too coordinated to be coincidence, and the playground renovation. Everyone knew the Vosges' name, no matter how hard Adam tried to hide behind foundations and charitable trusts. She tracked down his phone number. "Called him at midnight. Stop," she said when he answered. "No greeting, no preamble. Andrea, stop helping. Stop sending things. Stop paying for things. We don't want your money. I'm just trying to make things easier." "You're trying to buy absolution," Andrea interrupted. "And it's not for sale. Every toy you send, every bill you pay, every anonymous donation you make, it's all just you trying to feel better about what you did. But it doesn't work that way. You can't pay your way into their lives." "Then tell me what I can do," Adam said, and he was begging now, shame forgotten. "Tell me how to make this right." "There is no right," Andrea said quietly. "There's only forward, and forward for us doesn't include you." She hung up. Adam stared at his phone, then threw it across the room where it shattered against the wall. Fourth failed reunion. The fifth attempt came because of crisis. Jonah collapsed at school during recess. A severe asthma attack, the doctors would later say. The school called Andrea, and she left work immediately, her heart in her throat as she raced to Roosevelt Elementary. They transported Jonah to Mercy General, the same hospital where he'd been born. Andrea rode in the ambulance holding his small hand, watching his chest struggle for air. Praying harder than she'd prayed in years, the doctors stabilized him quickly, but he needed to stay overnight for observation. The tests they wanted to run, the specialists they wanted to consult, it all added up to thousands of dollars that Andrea's insurance wouldn't fully cover. She sat in the waiting room, doing mental arithmetic that didn't work. Rent was due. The boys needed winter coats. And now this. She'd figure it out. She always did. But God, she was so tired, Adam heard about it within hours. The private investigator he'd kept on retainer sent a message. "Emergency with one of the boys." Mercy General. Adam arrived at the hospital at midnight. Found Andrea alone in the waiting room, her head in her hands, looking more exhausted than anyone should look. "Andrea," he said softly. She looked up, and for a moment her guard dropped. She looked terrified and overwhelmed and so tired. Then she saw who it was and the walls went back up. "What are you doing here?" "I heard about Jonah. I wanted to help. Let me pay for—" "No," Andrea said, standing. "Absolutely not. Andrea, be reasonable. I have money. Let me help my son." "He's not your son," Andrea said, and the words were cutting. "You don't get to claim him when it's convenient. You couldn't protect any of them when they were inside me. You stood silent while your family wanted them erased. You don't get to play hero now because one of them is sick." "I'm not trying to play hero. I'm trying to help." "You're trying to feel better," Andrea said. "Every interaction we've had since the mall has been about your guilt, your regret, your need for redemption. But redemption isn't something you buy or manipulate into existence. It's something you earn over time with consistency and sacrifice and actual change." She moved closer, her voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. "You couldn't protect them when they were inside me. Don't act like a savior now." She walked back to Jonah's room, leaving Adam standing alone in the waiting room. He left without seeing his son. Paid the hospital bill anyway, through the same accounts, knowing Andrea would figure it out and probably find a way to pay him back. Fifth failed reunion. That night, driving home through empty streets, Adam finally understood. Andrea wasn't being cruel. She was being protective. She'd fought for those boys when he'd abandoned them. She'd kept them alive when he'd wanted them erased. She'd given them everything when he'd offered nothing. She didn't owe him access to the life she'd built from ruins, and maybe she never would. The realization didn't bring peace. It brought only a deeper understanding of everything he'd lost, everything he'd thrown away, everything he could never reclaim. Adam Vogus had been raised to believe money solved everything, that wealth was power and power was control, but Andrea Moreau had taught him a final brutal lesson. Some things can't be bought. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Some choices echo forever, and no amount of regret can silence them. He'd made his choice 5 years ago in a mansion filled with people who valued inheritance over humanity. Now he was living with the echo, and it was deafening. Wait, the story isn't over yet. A very powerful and emotional part 2 is waiting for you. If you want part 2, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and comment, "I want part 2." Till part 2. Goodbye, my beautiful family.